All right. I'm Barbara Flynn Curry, president of the IWIL Training Academy, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our annual Dawn Clark Netsch Policy Forum. Just FYI, the event will have closed captioning. You can turn this feature on and off on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Each year, we sponsor a forum in memory of Dawn, a true trailblazer in Illinois politics. Dawn was a state senator, she was the state's comptroller, and she was the Democratic candidate for governor of the state of Illinois. She was also one of the first women invited to teach in a United States law school. Dawn worked for women's rights, for civil rights, for human rights, and she was one of the IWIL founding mothers. Our topic, today's civil rights, reimagining public safety. Too many killings, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, the litany is long and it is appalling. The recent killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor at the hands of the police seem to have sparked a new era in our civil rights movement. Black lives do matter, and none of us can any longer ignore the systemic racism that infects our criminal justice system. Tonight, we will grapple with hard questions and difficult answers. But before we begin, a shout out to our IWIL Training Academy class of 2020, to our board members and to our alums. And a grateful welcome to all of our presenters, Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton, IWIL class of 2011, Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx, State Representative Jehan Gordon Booth, Senior Advisor to the Governor for Cannabis Control, former State Senator Toy Hutchinson. Toy is also a member of the Training Academy Board. Ralph Martire, the Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. And we're delighted to welcome 3 area chiefs of police. From Aurora, Chief Kristen Ziman; from Highland Park, Chief Lou Jogman; and from Oak Park, Chief LaDon Reynolds. After our first presentation, we'll divide into 3 simultaneous small group discussions, breakout rooms. You'll automatically find yourself in the group that you selected when you registered. So you don't have to do anything, it'll happen to you. After the breakouts, we'll reconvene for a discussion led by State's Attorney Kim Foxx with our police chiefs. And finally, we'll open it up for general questions moderated by Highland Park Mayor and IWILTA board member Nancy Rotary. We have some guidelines and we'll hope that you will follow them. Unless you're a presenter who is speaking, please mute yourself. When it's time for questions, ask yours in the chat box. And remember, we are all learning and we come from different perspectives and different backgrounds. Please be attentive, please be considerate, please be polite. Our first program recounts the context and the history of policing in America. It is my pleasure to welcome tonight's history teacher, Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton. Juliana was the director of the Center for Safety and Justice at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She went on to serve a single term in the Illinois House of Representatives, and then she moved up. A 2011 IWIL graduate, Juliana is a leader in the state's Justice, Equity, and Opportunity Initiative. She joined Governor Pritzker last week to announce a complete revamping of our state's Department of Juvenile Justice, a revamp that will offer smaller facilities closer to home, with less emphasis on punishment and more on youth development. Please join me in welcoming Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton.
Thank you so much to the Honorable Barbara Flynn Curry. Thank you for that kind introduction. And I'd like to thank the IWIL Training Academy team for inviting me to be with you tonight for the Dawn Clark Netsch Policy Forum. It is such an honor to be a part of the IWIL family as a proud class of 2011 delegate. And I've always appreciated the opportunity to learn so much from key policy experts during this annual policy forum. I'm grateful for all of the alums and delegates that are joining us tonight, as well as all of the participants who are taking time for this important conversation. It's an honor to be amongst these distinguished presenters that are addressing this year's topic, Today's Civil Rights, Reimagining Public Safety. Now, reimagining public safety is something that I spend most of my waking moments doing. First, I'm a restorative justice advocate and practitioner, and a trained peace circle keeper. So for the past 2 decades, I have come to learn a new way of thinking about justice that is very different from what has historically been a punitive system. Currently, when a harm is done or a crime is committed, our current justice system typically asks 3 questions. 1, what law was broken? 2, who broke it? And 3, what punishment is warranted? So a law is broken, there's an attempt to figure out who broke that law, and when the person is identified, the goal is to punish that person in some way, which often means incarceration. Restorative justice, however, is not focused on punishment. The questions that we would ask through a restorative justice lens are, number 1, who was harmed? Number 2, what are the needs and responsibilities of all affected? And number 3, how do the parties together address the needs and repair the harm? So through a restorative justice lens, we look to the harm that was done, and we go beyond the what to the why that harm was done. And then everyone involved is part of the solution for how to repair that harm. It allows room for the notion that hurt people, and that oftentimes when a crime is committed, it may not be as black and white as a law being broken and someone being a bad person who needs to be punished. It could be that someone has experienced trauma, that they have seen too much or experienced too much. It might be about someone who needs access to mental health resources. It might be someone whose basic needs are not being met: food, shelter, healthcare. And they're doing the very best that they can to try to survive in the best way that they know how. I begin with this backdrop because I believe it's important to understand that the system in which we currently operate is not the only model that exists. From the beginning of time, there are communities that have recognized that when a harm or a conflict arose in that community or village or tribe, that one did not have to go outside of that community to solve the problem. They did not have to call on some outside force to help them resolve the matter and restore peace to their community. Rather, what we say in the restorative justice world is that the wisdom is in the room, that by bringing all of the affected parties together to discuss the harm and emphasize accountability and work together to repair that harm that was done and rebuild relationships, then we don't have to get stuck on punishment for punishment's sake. And instead, we can move towards thinking about ways to truly make people and whole communities whole. Secondly, I spend much of my waking hours thinking about reimagining public safety because early on in our administration, Governor Pritzker signed an executive order establishing what's called the Justice, Equity, and Opportunity Initiative, or JEO as we call it. And it is housed in my office and under my leadership. The JEO initiative is focused on creating a justice system that better reflects our values. And what I always say is that if we are going to have a real conversation about public safety, then we simply must go beyond just policing, jails, and prisons. Instead, the conversation about real justice in all of our communities must include the topics of access to health care, including mental health care, affordable housing, pathways to education and economic opportunity, clean air and water, and access to nutritious and healthy foods. Why? Because a healthy community is a just community. A healthy community is a safe community. And if you were to look at any community in our state, a community that has everything required to meet the needs of that community, then you will most likely not see a significant police presence. It just doesn't happen. And far too many communities that are unhealthy, with the highest rates of arrest, the highest rates of detention and incarceration, are the communities that would be considered the most unhealthy communities. Communities that are food deserts with high rates of unemployment, with no green spaces and little access to healthcare, and almost no small businesses or other forms of economic development. So reimagining public safety for me every single day is about thinking about how safe these communities could be with intentional and long-term investments to ensure these communities can be as healthy as the most well-resourced communities in our state. So I've talked about restorative practices, and I've talked about intentional investment. And I started with that because I wanted to spark your imagination about what else is possible. Now, in the final minutes that I have left, let me get to what I was asked to share remarks on, and that is the historical context of policing in the United States. The challenge with this particular topic is that history shows a dramatically different context of policing depending on where and when you examine it. Many history books will tell us that the first modern police department in the United States was in Boston in the late 1830s. Cities followed one by one, and by the 1880s, all major US cities had municipal police forces. These organizations have been regarded by history as the genesis of policing as we know it today. Now, this version is problematic in that it ignores that policing was taking place in the South as early as 1704, when the first formal slave patrol was created. Slave patrols were much larger than those that eventually formed in Boston and other major cities. They served three purposes: to chase down enslaved men and women that had run away and return them to their owners, to intimidate and deter revolts among enslaved people, and to enforce plantation rules and administer punishment to those who violated those rules. Now, following the Civil War, these organizations evolved into modern police departments in the South and continued to employ means of control over formerly enslaved people and enforce Jim Crow segregation laws put into place to deny equal rights to those who were formerly enslaved. As we are repeatedly confronted with the devastating injustices that have been carried out by police across this country still today, it's impossible to ignore this legacy and the role that race continues to play in modern day policing. Just as race cannot be extricated from conversations of policing in the United States, class is also an essential factor in this history. The tragic reality is that our country was built on the exploitation of people and labor. Before the labor movement, the working class, regardless of race, was subject to long hours, dangerous working conditions, and low pay. Inequality increased rapidly, and wealthy elites wielded control over not just the workforce, but the political system with the power to impose regulation. Now, this took place in an era before carefully coordinated union strikes. The exploited working class resorted to rioting against their employers and the conditions in which they worked. During this time, the police organization served as a centralized group of men with the legal authority to use force to maintain order. Now, these police forces weren't protecting people so much as they were protecting the wealthy elite from those upon whom their wealth was built. The history of policing is wrought with examples of a system in which control is exerted over those who seek to challenge the economic and political elite. During the civil rights movement in the 1960s, policing and police brutality only deepened the social tension occurring throughout the country. Rather than reconcile its history and role as an oppressor, it doubled down on enforcing laws and systems that were by design meant to keep certain people down. It further reinforced policing to be not about crime control, but rather control over any person or group who dared to challenge the status quo. Policing as a practice only served during this time to create more crime. Now, since this time, and in response to criticism and public perception of law enforcement, investment has been made in more community relations programs and practices within police departments, as well as the strategy of community policing. While community policing, the concept of embedding more police officers within communities to build trust and partnerships, is an improvement over past practices, it has become abundantly clear in this day and age that it has done little to repair the years of unjust treatment and has been shown to have little impact on police violence and brutality. The recent tragic deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, and Tony McDade, and far too many others than I have time to name during the short time that I have with you tonight. These deaths at the hands of police officers have pushed us to a tipping point. All across the globe, in every state in our nation, in big cities and small towns across the state of Illinois, we are demanding accountability and that our nation control and confront, rather, its painful history of policing and the harm that has been caused to so many communities, but especially Black communities. So tonight, we are called to reimagine public safety. We are called to ask ourselves, in which ways have we turned to law enforcement to solve all of our social ills? To question why we have diverted money from things like education and healthcare while watching the budgets of police departments continue to balloon. And to explore how we now expect members of law enforcement to solve problems that could have been prevented or better addressed by adequately funding social programs, education, and healthcare systems. I'd like to close my remarks with a quote by Susan C. Young. She said these words: "Reimagination is the birthplace for vision and change. Your imagination is one of the most valuable talents you have, and it deserves your full attention." Thank you again for having me this evening. And thank you for giving your full attention to reimagining public safety, an effort to spark real vision and change. Black lives matter. Let's make sure that our policies and our practices reflect that every single day. Thank you.
We realize that our responses to their behaviors, behaviors that for many of us we recognize as childish, juvenile behavior, is separate and apart from that of criminal behavior, of choosing to engage in conduct that is akin to criminality. And I start with that in Illinois' role in history in recognizing the difference between adults and juveniles before we start talking about the school to prison pipeline, because I want us to center the fact that we have recognized that children are different. And yet, when we talk about the pipeline, if you will, there is a direct conduit when we have policing in our schools. There's a lot of conversation that's been happening across the country in the wake of George Floyd, and particularly here in Cook County in the Chicago area, around police and schools. And there is a divide for many about the necessity for police. If you listen to what Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton just said, that communities that are healthy and thriving tend to have less engagement with police. Communities that are healthy and thriving and have access to resources are far less likely to have police in their schools. On the flip side of that, on those communities that are under-resourced, that perhaps are living in neighborhoods that have been deprived of economic opportunity, educational attainment, and other basic necessities, it is in those schools that we often see the presence of police. Now, what does that mean? If you have a police officer in your schools, you are far more likely to, when there is an occasion where something deviates, where perhaps even a discipline problem occurs, to reach out to an officer, a school resource officer, for assistance. What then happens is that blurring of the lines between education and policing and law enforcement in the schoolhouse. And that becomes incredibly problematic. Prior to serving as your Cook County State's Attorney, I was an assistant state's attorney for 12 years. Of those 12 years, I spent the majority of my time in juvenile court. So I had real hand experience of seeing these cases up front. And when I tell you, we were seeing cases like kids who would get into fights on the schoolyard. Now, I will bust any illusions that I was a good kid when I was growing up. I got into my fair share of altercations, if you will, in school. And what would typically happen is that someone would call my mother or my grandmother. There would be some punishment to pay at home, but there was no involvement of police. When a child is arrested at school for fighting on the school grounds, what most people don't realize is that is a felony. It's an aggravated battery in the public way. When we are introducing criminal attachments to childlike behavior, it changes the whole trajectory. And what that then means is the earlier, the younger that we introduce people to the criminal justice system, studies have shown that there then becomes a long entanglement of that young person into the system. Again, from firsthand knowledge, very often we would see the young people who we were prosecuting return back and graduating into other behaviors. Now, if you know anything about young people, or remember from your time as being a young person, particularly in adolescence, that peer group experience is everything. And it is why, as parents, you want to make sure that your kids are hanging around in positive peer circles, and why you want to make sure that they're not hanging out with those who are less positive. So imagine if you are engaging young people into our criminal justice system early, that we are using law enforcement to handle discipline issues. And we have young people over at our juvenile temporary detention center. When you are talking about peer groups, having young people now introduced to a peer group of others who are entangled in the criminal justice system then introduces them to a larger network of those who are engaging in that type of behavior. And what does that mean? They learn better ways to do the things that we want them to stop doing. They have peers who are validating the things that they have done. It is not in any way making the behaviors that they've engaged with better. In fact, the research and data shows the young people who come out of the justice system or come out of our juvenile temporary detention center fare worse. So contrary to conventional wisdom that I would often hear from parents who would come in and say, this will teach them. If you hold them, this will teach them the lesson. The reality is that the lessons that we were teaching them were not positive lessons. The lessons that we were teaching them were, in fact, lessons on how to continue to graduate through our criminal justice system. And so when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, we have to be mindful of making sure that we're not reflexively using our criminal system, our criminal legal system, to deal with these issues that can be dealt with in a disciplinary manner. At the same time, we also have to make sure we're not doing an over-reliance on disciplinary measures that are overly punitive. What we see, particularly for young men who come into the criminal justice system or the juvenile justice system, many of them have been suspended from school. Many of the behaviors that perhaps they've not used to engage law enforcement are dealt with out-of-school suspensions. One of the worst things, again, that we can do for young people who are engaging in problematic behaviors, who are in need of some type of intervention, is turn them away from schools. The data and research also shows that for those young people who have been suspended for school for a period of 3 or more days, have a higher likelihood of engaging in our juvenile justice system. And again, setting the foundation and that framework for entering into the adult criminal justice system. In Illinois, we've done a tremendous job over the last several years in recognizing the roles that schools and law enforcement have in the school to prison pipeline, and have done a number of things to be able to address that, to minimize the contact of the criminal justice system. Some of that is included raising the age of majority here in Illinois from 17 to 18, with the incredible leadership of many who are on this call today. It has also meant raising the age for automatic transfer, by which we try young people as in the adult criminal justice system versus the juvenile justice system. Also advocating and pushing for minimizing the use of out-of-school suspensions and in-school suspensions. And additionally, working to ensure that we are not using the criminal justice system or the juvenile justice system to deal with disciplinary issues. All of which would have the great understanding, again, as I started in the beginning, that the earlier that we entangle young people in the system, the longer they will last and the greater the opportunity for them to graduate into our adult system. And so there is a direct contact. And again, if we look at those schools that have the highest contacts with young people in our juvenile justice system, it is in those parts of our community that are the most under-resourced, that don't have access to the restorative justice programming that Lieutenant Governor Stratton just talked about. Where we see in other areas of our communities where they invest in peer juries or other restorative justice programming, where the young people are part of the solution of trying to fashion accountability and wholeness, we see better outcomes. And so we must reject the reflexive notion and rhetoric that neighborhoods that are contending with violence need greater policing presence. In fact, it is quite the opposite. They need a greater infusion of resources to deal with restorative justice and the things that cause young people to act out. One, normal acting out, and then when they go above and beyond that. And again, use our resources and the power of our prosecutorial arm and our juvenile detention centers for those who truly need it. I will end on this before I turn it over to Ralph. I was very encouraged by Lieutenant Governor Stratton and Governor Pritzker's announcement last week about the shrinking of the Department of Juvenile Justice. Again, a further recognition that we must change the trajectory on how we deal with young people who are engaging in these behaviors and getting to the why and how do we heal and make whole those who find themselves caught up in these systems. We are all better for it. With that, I'll turn it over to Ralph.
Hi, this is Ralph Martire, and I am Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. I'm thrilled to be part of this program, thrilled to be on any panel with Kim, who is a great American and has far more charisma than me, so you're just gonna have to deal with a former corporate lawyer in this presentation. Now, when we look at things at the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, we look for long-term trends, big trends, and systems changes. And what we try to do is identify ways we can make the situation better. So I think a good starting point on this is looking at how we fund schools, what happens in schools on a disproportionate basis between whites and blacks when it comes to things like discipline, and then see, well, how do we fix all those things? So let me just give you some stats. I know Kim talked, I thought, very, very well on the subject of school resource officers. They really came into vogue as a response to Columbine. And a lot of schools were very worried about shooters, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now they've been around for a long time. And what the research shows is they don't enhance safety at the school. They just don't. What they do is they arrest kids. And it's very interesting, the national statistics, 36% of the arrests made by SROs, school resource officers, are Black kids, even though Black kids are only 15% of our student population. 30% of those arrests are whites, even though white kids are 50% of the population. So right there, you see a disproportionate impact on our African-American kids. And what frequently happens then, these children get expended or removed from the school and sent to a disciplinary styled alternative schools. Well, guess what happens in an alternative school? They aren't subject to the same educational standards of a regular school. So the amount of time these children spend in the alternative schools, they frequently fall way behind their peers on skill sets. That's a huge problem in the modern economy when educational attainment is more strongly correlated with your wage and employability than any time in the past. In fact, those two things, educational attainment and employability and wage, are not just statistically meaningfully related to each other. The relationship has more than doubled since 1980. So disadvantaging these kids on the front end by creating a criminal record for them, sticking them in an alternative school, and having that alternative school provide them with an inferior education means these students really aren't going to have the opportunity to be active, productive members of society, and the likelihood of their staying in the criminal justice system on the wrong side of the criminal justice system thereafter is very high. So that's challenging point one, is that things going on within the school themselves seem to be discriminatory in their impact at Black versus white kids. Now let's look at the schools we have in Illinois overall. We have good news here and we have bad news here, because in Illinois, you can't just have good news, you have to have bad news as well. So the good news is, a couple of years ago, we passed a new school funding formula called the evidence-based formula. It is the best practice school formula in all of America. What it does is it ties the investment we make as taxpayers in the education of our children to the cost of paying for those educational practices, which the research show actually work. What a crazy concept. And better yet, there's not like some $1 amount per kid like we had in our old foundation formula that's good for every school district in Illinois. Instead, the amount of investment made in a school district is modified, predicated on the very specific demographics of that school district. So your number of low-income kids, your number of English learners, your number of special needs kids, that all increases the amount of resources you get to implement these evidence-based practices. So now we have this model that tells us exactly what it would cost each district to provide an adequate education to their kid. Well, here's the problem. The last time the Illinois State Board of Education ran the full evidence-based model, they said, hey, we're almost $7 billion short statewide of what the evidence indicates is needed to educate all of our children. Now, what's really powerful about this model is we can break that shortage down, that gap down, on a per student basis. So for instance, on average, a white student in Illinois who's attending an underfunded school is looking at a gap in funding per pupil of about $3,500 per kid. Your typical African-American student is looking at a gap of almost $5,000 per kid in funding, almost 40% more. And that disparate funding has been going on for generations. So in an underfunded school system, where many of our children, white or Black, are facing are receiving an education that really doesn't have the resources to provide them with what they need. We've singled out Black and brown students, by the way. I should include Latinx here because the numbers are similar for the gaps facing Latinx students. We've singled out our Black and brown students for particularly poorly funded education. Think about this again, at a time when the correlations between your educational attainment and your economic viability matter more than ever before. And so it's no wonder that the wage gap between whites and African Americans has worsened by well over 100% in Illinois since 1980. I mean, basically, what we are doing is we are providing an education that specifically disadvantages African American kids versus their white peers. and learning those skill sets, numeracy, literacy, et cetera, they need to go on and credential themselves to the next level and have the capacity to be a high wage earner in the modern economy. That's a structurally racist system. And we can fix it, of course, if we're only willing to make an adequate investment in education for all our kids. The good news is we only have to put in $7 billion more. Yeah, I'm smiling when I say that. Illinois has an $888 billion economy. It's literally less than 1% of our economic activity we'd have to invest in educating all our kids. That is such a small cost, it can't even be measured by any peer-reviewed econometric model that looks at whether or not a tax increase could harm your economy. It's too small, too small. And we're letting an investment that's too small to be measured stand in the way of really giving our African-American kids one of the key advantages they need to escape this school to prison pipeline, to arm themselves with the skill sets they need to credential themselves at the next level. And I want to translate that to dollars. So if nationally, and this is just national data, we were able to eliminate the achievement gap academically between white and black students, over the next 80 years, we would generate an additional $50 trillion for the US economy, 50 trillion with a T, present value. If we could get the graduation rate up for African-American kids to 90%, guess what? That adds over $6.6 billion to our economy annually. In Illinois, it adds over a quarter of a billion. These things have value, and we have to be willing to make the investments. Unfortunately, the data is going the other way. So this is national data, not Illinois data, but Illinois is following a similar trend. So from 1979 to 2013, nationally, states did double their investment in education overall. That's a good thing, but they quadrupled their investment in the criminal justice system. Not such a good thing. And even though there is significantly more money being spent on education nationally and in Illinois than there is on the criminal justice system, we have to educate all our kids. We don't have to incarcerate all our kids. So it's understandable that there'd be a difference in total amounts spent. But from a taxpayer standpoint, it makes no sense not to create the kind of school system that has the capacity to provide every student what they need to succeed in the modern economy. The cost of fully funding the evidence-based formula, I've given you the total number, but it breaks down to about $14,000 per kid in total expenditures. That's what we'd have to get up to on average. Obviously, it would be different in different communities. Some would have to spend a lot more to get equal academic outcomes with others. The cost of incarcerating a person in Illinois is over $51,000 a year. It strikes me as that's a no-brainer choice for taxpayers. You know, let's find the capacity to build our educational system using this great evidence-based funding formula and make the investments we need. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see these racially disparate and negative outcomes driven by a system that is, in fact, structurally racist in how it's funded and how it provides education to kids. I'll throw out one more data set on just arrests, and Kim, you probably know this inside and out. Now, the most recent data I could find was from 2012, but in 2012, of the 46,800 juvenile arrests made in Illinois, 59% were African Americans and 40% were white. And that same year in Cook County, 72% of the juveniles arrested were African American. This very much is traceable to our failure as a state to provide an adequate education that meets the needs of our students. Every student has the capacity to learn. Not every student will. Some students will choose not to, but we need to give them the opportunity. And so there are ways to actually address the school to prison pipeline, to alleviate this problem, and actually not just enhance our educational system and reduce sort of the arrest rates for our African American kids, but create a much better economy for everyone. As my grandma Tusio used to say, everybody do better when everybody do better. I'm ending there because I'm Italian. I can talk the whole time, Kim. I could monopolize things, so I'm not going to do that.
It was a great way to end. Thank you both so much. And we just have a little bit of time left, but I wanted to get to at least one question from the chat, and I'll start with this one. So from C Blue for State's Attorney Foxx or Ralph as well, to what extent are you working with Chicago Public Schools on initiatives such as reducing suspensions and use of the criminal justice system for discipline?
Yeah, we've been working with CPS for a couple of years now. Jadine Chow, who's the director of security there, and I had been working even before I was elected into this position to look at their practices. They've changed their code of conduct a couple times in the last 10 years or so, which they have now shrunk the footprint for things for which they will have police intervention and things by which someone would be subjected to an out-of-school suspension versus an in-school suspension. One of the things that was really important to us was to show them our data of the cases that were coming in so that they could see how disparate schools were handling these instances. One thing that we found in my career is that most people would be surprised if I told you what is the month that you think that we see the most arrests for young people. And people would instinctively say June, July, when school is out and kids have no place to go. And the reality is we see the bulk of our arrests for young people in September and October. Why? Because they're in school and you have this captive audience. So a lot of the behaviors where we say the young people will be young people is when they're around each other. So we share that data with CPS to say, hey, this is what's happening. You all are kind of the hub for where we see these arrests. How do we work differently? And we've been able to see a substantial change. In 2018, it was the lowest number of cases that we had for school-based arrests in 10 years.
Wow, thank you so much. I wish we had more time, but we have a very packed schedule, so we are going to go back to the main session and continue learning. Thank you all.
We're live. My name is Toy Hutchinson, and I'm here to talk about, we wanted to put this topic into the conversation because it's so multi-layered and multifaceted, and we're really in a moment in time now where you really can't talk about cannabis without talking about all the principles of equity that go with it. And if you do, you're really missing the boat. So it's complicated and it's difficult. It's probably the biggest and hardest thing I've ever worked on. But I'll give you a little background as to how we got to where we are right now. So 6 years ago, we had a medical program, it was a pilot medical program in the state of Illinois with a very narrow patient thing. And there was a competitive application that went out. And what ended up happening is that we were left with an industry that was here along with 33 other states that was all white and all male. There were more than a couple of reasons for that. One of them was we had a couple of Black owners early on, but it was too difficult to stay in business. The constraints were too hard. The patient counts weren't enough. We didn't have enough ailments in there. And the points in terms of whether or not you could participate from a minority standpoint were so minuscule that you could get around that. So we really spent 3 years studying all the other states. And it started with the decriminalization. So like when we talk about reimagining public safety, you have a product for which 800,000 people are arrested across the country every single year for cannabis. And we also know that in that space, even in legal states, once you legalize these things, we still see high arrest records, high levels of street harassment, high levels of all of the negative effects that go with that. So we wanted to design a program that would have 3 principles of equity. 1, how do you change the face of the industry? 2, what do you do with the money? And 3, how do you undo the harms? And so it was an ambitious thing to start, and we knew that nobody else had really figured it out. So it's not like we had breadcrumbs to follow. So we had, right now, the situation across the country is that the industry still looks the way the industry looks. It's all white and it's all male everywhere, including here. It is one of those places, it's like, no matter what jurisdiction you go to, you will find the exact same operators, and you'll find a mix of multi-state vertically integrated operators and then independent shops that struggle to compete in that arena. Now, even in the places where there's independent operators that are operating, they're still operating in a way where the initial operators still have the ability, they're running the entire industry. They're still the ones that are out there, those first entrants, early entrants, because they're well capitalized. They were able to get up and running first. We decided here we had one of two choices. Like, everybody could go at the same time, or we could start an industry so that we could fund the other part. So the way the 3 pillars work is that the original operators are the ones who fund the revolving loan program to deal with the #1 barrier to entrance, which is access to capital. So there's no other state that put millions of dollars behind helping small folks and equity applicants in particular have access to start capital. And that's important for a couple of different reasons. One is the high regulatory cost, the tax implications, the fact that this is still illegal federally means that that's why you see the same people being able to get in and get started. So they fund the $31 million revolving loan thing, which we then direct immediately to equity applicants. Then you had an application process that we had to figure out how to go through. And that was, we wanted to make sure that the equity points on those things were significant, so significant that you couldn't leave them on the table. The only way to do this is to have those things as a part of the thing. Then 3, the money from the sale of cannabis, which is probably one of the things that is significant to me, because in a mature market, you're talking about $125 million that can be steered directly to communities that, you know, if you're a member of the African American caucus, the Latino caucus, or if you fight for every dollar you can get to go rebuild or reinvest in communities. And the fact that this is now tied to the sale of the plant, so that every single part of the process has to tie back to the people who are harmed most by the process. So right now we have the expungements and sealings happening. It's working its way through its system, even though court systems are closed. We have a situation now where it's like, we're getting very, very close to letting out or announcing who license winners will be on this first round. And in that sense, it's like, and then we have very, very high receipts, which are funding the R3 program to go back to those communities. So they all work in each one of these silos is designed to work together. Like, and if you take one of them out, now you'll have a lot of people come to this from a lot of different standpoints, a lot of different perspectives, and a lot of different perspectives. When I think about reimagining public safety, I think it's all encapsulated in cannabis, all of it, because we know that if the war on drugs was race specific, we got to try to figure out some sort of way to correct for those things. And that is, there's a reason why it's been very difficult to do it across the country and around the world. It is a really difficult thing to do, especially with the judiciary system we have right now, the courts, the way they're packed right now. And so we started from the standpoint of what worked, what got challenged, what got struck, and then we tried to build a process that was around that, while we would do it on a small scale so that we could protect future market share, to be able to, as we add new entrants, to actually do things to change the face of the industry. That is different than any other state did, because what every other state did that went adult, they had a ballot referenda, they put it out on the street, they said, we're gonna tax and regulate this like alcohol. The people said yes, and then they gave licenses, all of them. So right now, in a situation in the state of California, they've been waiting for 4 years for an equity license to be let. In Maryland, there's no equity licenses let. In Massachusetts, they've not yet let an equity license out. So what's about to happen here in the state is that we'll actually be the first state, and we'll be the first state to actually attempt to do this and get the licenses out in the same calendar year the law went live. So right now, in this moment, you know, I think about how we build the structure to change something that has got an 80-year genesis, and for the industry in particular, a 10-year head start, while we're 7-8 months in. I forgot about the pandemic. It was just in the middle of a global pandemic where all governmental processes shut down. But it is it's fascinating to watch this unfold. It's fascinating to be in a situation to try to shape the policy that's around it. And while it's probably the biggest and hardest thing I've ever worked on, I really believe in the work, because at the end of the day, every place that the industry existed in its current way, every way we adjudicated this plant in its current fashion looked the same in every other state. This is the first time that we've tried to break that. And so, you know, the pause that we built in to see, okay, so 70, we can have up to 500 licenses, 500 dispensaries. We'll do 75 this first time. And that's designed specifically to not open the door as wide as you could to protect, A, to protect the future market share, and B, to tweak as we go along. So typically I tell people, you know, when folks expect us to be Colorado yesterday or Colorado on January 1 or any other state that operates, is that we know giants of history. We know Thurgood Marshall, Brown Board of Education, but most of us don't know the 5 cases that got him to the Supreme Court, the things you had to do at the baseline to continue to fight and break down, tear down walls and change processes and embed systems and all of those things that have to happen along the way. So this is the beginning of what is we're trying to attempt. And, you know, it's like, I never thought that I was going to be able to change 80 years of drug policy with one bill. But I will say, when I look at where we are in comparison to every other state that's attempted this, it really is a case study in drug policy reform, criminal justice reform, and how you reinvest in communities tied to the things that hurt the communities the worst in the first place. And that's significant. So I am going to go to the chat box. I know there's questions coming in here. Let's scroll to the top of the chat box. I guess everybody can see the chat box. Okay.
Hey, Senator, we just let everybody know that they can start putting their questions in the chat box.
Perfect.
If anybody has any questions, this is a fantastic time to start putting them in the chat box.
Yeah. Oh, hi, Maze. Yeah, we're trying to change that. So his question is, can everybody hear me? Is it coming across okay? So the question was like, this still equals no Black ownership, true? That's what we're trying to change. And so we're hoping that this license that gets lets out right now is gonna be the first step in changing that. And really the only thing you can say about that is that it takes a process. We had to come up with a process. And so if someone can show me where that process has worked anywhere else, because you can't, this is what we have to go through. This is a long game, a long haul, and changing people's mind, not only generationally, but there's a stigma attached to the plant. There's hypocrisy attached to the plant. There's over-policing attached to the plant. And there's been literally an economic system that locked Black and brown folks out of it, locked us up, locked us out. So making it so that we removed all excluded offenses. So even if you did have something in your prior background, that wouldn't bar you to an opportunity for licensure. And then insisting that that a large lion's share of that money that comes out of it goes back into those very same communities. So they act hand in hand right now, and we're in the middle of a process of trying to get it through. So no, believe me, I cannot wait. I cannot wait to go through and to see exactly how this worked, and also to begin the disparity study so that we can make the changes specifically that we would need to keep going. And that's, again, designed to make it so that we still have market share to compete. But the worst thing that I think could happen is if we let out hundreds of licenses, and then the same people get those licenses, meaning that if you're an equity applicant and you come online, what market are you competing in? And so it was, a lot of the stuff was very intentional. And so these things that we're learning along the way right now are things that have to happen. Let's see, 60 messages. Do you want, Leslie, new leaf, developing legal aid expungement work. Oh, Leslie, did you want to join in and say that?
Sure, or you could read it. I just, or everyone could read it, but hi, Leslie Corbett with the Illinois Equal Justice Foundation. And I just wanted to comment on the amazing work that's happening because of these social equity funds that have been generated by the sale of cannabis. There will be a new resource, legal aid resource, to help folks clear their record and decriminalize cannabis. And it's called New Leaf, Illinois, and it'll be launching this fall. So there'll be a big PR blitz about it then, but I just wanted to let folks know that that's in the works. And thank you, Toy, for all your hard work on that. We really appreciate it.
Well, I'm excited to see the thing. We also have some new folks that are coming in and reaching out to talk about creating a statewide and actually adding to the work that you guys are doing on around clemency. So people who are incarcerated right now, currently, because it's complicated when you start to get cases and things that are interwoven together. And I remember this conversation about making sure we funded and had money to fund legal aid. Leslie and I talked about that a lot when I was still in the Senate, but making sure that we were able to fund legal aid services around the state, because if you don't live in the city of Chicago, it's really hard. And if you live in some place where there's a unfriendly state's attorney, and we have lots of them who do not look at this the way a Kim Foxx would. So there really is, it's a multifaceted level of work, and we can't take our eye off any of it. The other thing I want to say about the importance of ownership in this is that, you know, that I saw a chart once about John H. Johnson, who, you know, owned Ebony and Jet, and it literally points at how many different businesses and how that one person in business in the city of Chicago did so much to lift an entire class of folks up in the city. And then what happened when we lost that? So it's not just about the few people who might get this license as this is rolling out, because, you know, everyone asks me, like, what about no Black ownership right now? We haven't had Black ownership in 6 years. That's what we're trying to change. So let us try to change that. Like, there's no, if you look at this, I saw an article that said 77% of the Illinois cannabis industry is owned by 6 companies. Well, 89% of the cannabis industry in the world is owned by 8 or 9 companies. This is, you know, I would try to solve all problems with one piece of legislation, but that's not possible. So we're taking the best stab we can at it right now. When these licenses are let out, then we can be able to answer that question. But this is all designed to make it so that you have businesses that can start in communities who then can decide to choose who their accountant is, who their HVAC people are, who their trucking folks are. Like the ancillary businesses that go around all this, whether you touch the plant or not, is just as significant as undoing the harms for people who have they don't want to go into the cannabis industry. They just want to be able to get a job. They want to live their lives and want to support their families. And communities that have healthy indices don't have excessive police presence. So it all works in tandem. Probably the hardest thing is that we did a disparity study to create a sheltered market on the procurement side. So and even with that, we don't have Black and brown businesses that own 20% of anything. Nothing. We don't have state spend that goes to 20% of anything. Like, there's not one single industry. You name one, there isn't one. This is one of these times where it's like, we have a shot to do something different. So we have to take the shot because it means so much to so many different people. But it's like, you really have to understand that it's a long game. Like, this is still not going to be where we want it to be at the outset. So I never really thought that success was January 1, 2020. I really think it's what happened when we look at January 1, 2021, what happened in 2022, because we had a system in place that was predicated on all kinds of reasons for why it's the way it is. And this is the first attempt to change it. So we're in September. The law went live in January. I'm sorry, it's not fixed yet. It's coming, and we got to work. We got a lot of work to do, a lot of work to do. What are some of these other ones? Okay, so the KPMG, the KPMG contract on social equity licenses. One of the things that we had to do was make sure that there was we tried to remove as much bias. Like, you used to be able to do as much as you can. You could get a letter of support from an elected official, and that would, get you someplace further. We wanted to try to remove as much bias into the grading process as possible. And that is something that, since we layered a very, very big cannabis program on top of a very small pilot program, was something that staff was not able to do that. We had to figure out a way to get these things counted and graded in a transparent and ethical way. So that's why the contract was given out. The licenses are not out because all of state government shut down. And then we had a rules issue that needed a statutory fix, and we didn't have session this year. So we had a 4-month session truncated into 72 hours. And so everything didn't make it across the finish line. But it is incumbent upon us to remember that the sales that are coming from those things are being reinvested. The sales that are coming, those receipts are funding our expungement and criminal justice aspects, and the licenses are coming out. In the next few weeks, they're coming out. So the idea that this is cornering the market in a way that is unrecoverable is not true. That's a myth. You don't saturate the market until you get one dispensary for every about 6,000 to 10,000 people. We will have one dispensary for every 124,000 people. What we're showing is that there's plenty of room to grow. And I'm gonna do everything I can to protect market share for those people who are coming online. And that's what we're in the process of doing right now. We're trying to get these people online. And so every day that goes by, as if there was anything that I worried about on a regular basis, it's like, how do we change the face of this industry so that we can pull all these silos together and also do it in a time frame in which the whole world turned upside down. So that's where we're at. Anything?
Great. And just so we know, we've got about 5 minutes left before we all go back together. I know there are still more questions in here, Senator. One of the questions, I know you spoke a little bit to this, but how can we ensure that the disadvantaged communities are accessing the tax funds that are being collected and making sure that they're allocated back into the community?
So the notice of funding opportunity went out, and agencies are now able to apply for those funds. And here's what's significant about those funds. Typically, the way those things went out is that the larger social service agencies were the ones who landed the lion's share of all those things. So if you remember the budget impasse, the 2-year budget impasse, there were a lot of small social service agencies all across the state that could not weather that. This is designed so that people can not be told what we want to do for you and your communities, but have communities say, these are the things that we think we need, so they can apply for this money. And it is a pot that is going to continue to grow. And the best thing about it is that it doesn't go to the general revenue fund. It gets taken off the top directly to the R3 fund. That was a significant win for communities that have been struggling for reinvestment for decades and decades and decades. So really, you know, like while I'm ending this, I don't always have a long time to talk about this. I will say that we are in the, for lack of a better phrase, the planting season. You know, we had January and February pretty quiet. COVID hit in March. This has proven to be recession proof and pandemic proof. But at the next few weeks, I think we're gonna start to pull in that other large part of the silo, so that we can start to tell a whole fulsome story about what happened in this space over the course of this year. And I'm really proud of all the people who put everything on the line to try to get a shot at this. And all the people, especially the advocates on the ground, who've been talking about this for 30, 40 years when nobody would listen. Nobody listened. Politicians didn't listen. People who had power to do something didn't listen. Nobody listened. And so when we studied all that, this is what we tried to do. And we're in the process of doing it. And so watching this play out is an honor. It's hard, but it's an honor, because I know that at the end of the day, we're going to tell a different story in Illinois. We just have to get through this part.
Great. Senator, we have another question here. Does the cannabis legislation address the prospective increase in demand for mental and health services?
Not so much, but no, not so much, except for the fact that as receipts grow, that fund grows. So I think the legislature will be able to like expand how many things they're able to do with it. There's a portion that goes to mental health and substance abuse things. And there's a portion of those things that can be addressed just through the R3 program, just through the Community Reinvestment Fund. The good thing is that wherever cannabis exists, it's a revenue generator. It's not drawing money from the general revenue fund. And in times like this, we have to really be laser focused on that. And so I just want to reiterate, all 3 silos of these things work together in tandem. And they're all playing a role right now. So while I'm trying to coordinate literally 13 agencies, Cannabis touches 13 agencies, and try to wrangle an industry that is volatile and dynamic and quick moving and knows how to operate in multi-states. Like that's a learning curve that I've been going through for the last 8 months. We're starting to see the changes, and so there'll be announcements coming as the weeks go by as to how this grows. But I would just encourage everybody to understand that this is month 8. The law went live in January. I don't know of any piece of legislation that fixes the world in 8 months. That show me, because show me, it just doesn't exist. So I'm working as hard as I possibly can on an issue I care so deeply about. This is the path we decided to take, because I really want to, you know, I have 3 kids. I have 2 sons and a daughter, and I need them to know that when I had a chance to do something, I did, no matter what anybody said about it.
Senator, thank you so much for your time. You know, we could have this conversation, I think, for a couple of hours if we all had the time to do it. I know we're going to be switching back here soon, but thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
There we go. Unmuted.
There we go.
Hey, everybody. Thank you guys for being here this evening. Thank you for being in this space with all of us today. If I could, one moment, take the liberty to say hi to a couple of my colleagues. I see Representative Greenwood. I see Representative Gable. Is there anyone else that I see? Is there any? Oh, yes, Representative Mustman is in here. I just want to quickly acknowledge my colleagues that I have not seen in a month of Sundays. I hope I'm not leaving anybody off. But with that said, I just want to thank everyone for, again, being here this evening. And just kind of wanted to share some, when I was asked if I would be willing to do this, number one, Toy asked me, never tell Toy no. She's quite persistent. But also this issue is very near and dear to me. I got into the space, like many people do, around the issue of trauma and trauma-informed practices the hard way. Just a quick, brief story about me. I'm 37 years old. I have been in the Illinois General Assembly. This is my 11th year. And in May of 2014, I was pregnant with my daughter, Juliana. And that week was an amazing week. My colleagues had come together and thrown me a baby shower, and went home that Friday and went to bed. I was as big as a tanker. And, you know, ladies, for those of you that have had a child, you know, you get so placed, you get so big that you can't lay down in the bed anymore. You have to sleep, you have to sit upright in a chair. I was that big. I was 9 months pregnant. I could no longer sleep in the bed. And we got the call that a lot of families across this country get in the middle of the night saying that your son has been shot. And 9 months pregnant, I rushed to the car along with my husband. A very silent ride. We live in Peoria, so it's not a big town. It was probably a quick ride, but it felt like it was forever. The entire time we were not talking, but thinking the same thing, like, Lord, please just let him be shot in the leg. We get there, they immediately send us to the back room. I've been in that room before. It's typically not good when they take you to one of those back rooms. We had probably been there 15 minutes. 3 doctors walked in the room, took off their hat, put it on his chest, and said, I'm sorry, we've done all we can do, but your son is dead. And that was the beginning of a nightmare for myself, for my husband, for my entire family, and really our community. I was serving in the Illinois General Assembly when this took place. And so our family, we had our own personal journey. For myself, my husband, at the time, my son Chancellor was 12 years old, about to be 11, about to be 12 years old. He and DJ were very close. And so I firsthand watched how our family that has access to resources, we have health insurance, we have access to the things that a family needs when they go through crises like this. But then there was also the issue of what it means to actually go through a murder trial and what it means to actually be supportive of potential witnesses and the things that they must go through. And so I was sort of thrown into this space. And I just remember at one time thinking like, Lord, why is this happening? I'd already been through a few other things, but I look back on it now, and one of my favorite Bible verses, Romans 8:28, and it's God works all things together for the good for those that believe in him. And I live by that, because no matter what you are handed in life, there's a way to use what you are experiencing to help other folks. And so the experience that our family went through and our community went through when DJ was murdered, it has absolutely informed the work that I do in the Illinois General Assembly around violence prevention work, criminal justice reform work, including trauma-informed practices. And so there was a brief comment earlier about some legislation that I worked on. I see one of the individuals that was a partner in that work, Mike Weir. Hey, Mike, I see you on there. We were able to pass some groundbreaking legislation nationally called the Neighborhood Safety Act. And a part of that act, we were able to create the first of its kind trauma recovery centers. And the reason why trauma recovery centers are so important in communities across the state is because we regularly see the stories around what's happening in Chicago, what's happening in Peoria, what's happening in many cities across the state. And we often think, well, what is the antidote to the spike in violence, the pandemic health crisis, the urgent calls for justice and safety in communities, again, like Peoria, like Chicago, like East St. Louis, like many other places in the state. And the reality of it is that we have to reimagine public safety. And when I think of reimagining public safety, and many of you have probably heard about the move to defund the police. I, like a lot of folks, I was defund the police. I want the police to respond to my calls. So I, like many of you, had to go through a learning process about what they're really saying. And to me, what they're talking about is really what we already believe, right? We believe that police should be focusing on crimes and people that are committing crimes, criminals. Police should not be responding to mental health crises. Police are not social workers. They're not medical professionals. They're not education specialists. There are a lot of things, but they aren't those things. And so when we begin to reimagine public safety, we have to reimagine, well, what are the things that we can embed into our community to become sort of the pillars in our community? And so again, these trauma recovery centers, we have one in Peoria. They're located in Chicago. There's one that's about to be built out in East St. Louis. And what these trauma recovery centers look like is the way in which we are building these out across the state is we are putting them in underutilized school systems. How many of you, by a show of hands, how many of you all have an underutilized school building in your community? Quick show of hands. Underutilized, right? It's just the trends and the way people are moving. Many of us have underutilized schools in our communities. And so what we're doing is we're putting these trauma recovery centers in communities that are the most harmed and the least served. And what we're creating, and oftentimes when I talk about trauma recovery centers, people often think about ERs and people coming through on stretchers and having gaping wounds, but that's not really what a trauma recovery center is. A trauma recovery center is a place where you do go get help, but it's those wounds to the soul. It's the ones that you don't see, but they are everlasting. And if you don't deal with it, they have a tendency to deal with you. And so we've been able to build out some of these spaces throughout the state that have access to where you'll be able to go to this trauma recovery center and get access to cognitive behavioral therapy. You can get access to mental health counseling, alcohol abuse counseling. There are oftentimes food pantries in these places because, when we're talking about communities, Lieutenant Governor Stratton, she really laid it out so eloquently earlier. When you see communities that have strong housing, that don't have a bunch of food deserts, that have the appropriate healthcare systems, you don't see the over police presence. But when we have communities that don't have that, all of these things are going to be issues. And so one of the ways by which we have been looking to engage people is we create these trauma recovery centers, again, inside school buildings, embedded in neighborhoods, so that people are comfortable going to and engaging in these spaces. Two, you have the ability to go in there and there's not just one thing. So it's not the place where if you're seeing going in or out, people ride by and think, oh, she must be going to get some help. We know that there's a stigma with mental health services often. So the way that these trauma recovery centers have been built out best practices show that whatever the needs of your community are, you're able to build out these trauma recovery centers in a way that actually meets the needs of your community. So for example, in Peoria, our trauma recovery center, we have Department of Juvenile Justice is in there. One of the main reasons why young people were violating their parole was because they were missing parole appointments. Now, students don't miss parole appointments because you're able to go right there in the school system. There's a food pantry. Oftentimes, people don't realize that they need help. They don't realize that they are suffering severely with trauma. Oftentimes, as trauma can be a generational cycle that you just pass on to your children and to your family, and trauma can become normalized. Well, in those scenarios, in those situations, you really have to do a lot of work with some very special people. And one of the things that can become a challenge in terms of being able to get people to access the support that they need is, one, they need to know that it's available. Two, they need to be comfortable accessing that. And so by embedding a food pantry inside of the trauma recovery center, oftentimes people are going there to get one need met and learning about other needs that they are also able to get met there. We have a federally qualified healthcare system that's inside the trauma recovery center, two hospital systems, a housing network that helps people get placed in housing. We are also doing expungement. We're also doing expungements. There's a lawyer there every week that helps people clear their records up. So literally from food to housing to making sure that, kids get off of parole successfully, probation successfully, having the ability to get access to high quality health care through the two hospital systems that are embedded inside the trauma recovery center. And many of you that may be around or connected to healthcare, you know how territorial hospitals can get at times. The fact that we were able to get two hospital systems to be able to be willing to collaborate and provide different services to the community has been just such a blessing. And I want to take it back. I know I can talk fast and I'll talk a lot, but I wanted to share this with you all because this work was born out of a great deal of pain. Pain that I experienced and that my husband experienced. I've watched my son grapple with the pain of losing his older brother who he was so close to. We lived in our home, who he was so close to at such a critical phase in his life. And we're still dealing with it, to be honest with you. My daughter is 6 years old and she constantly talks about her brother in heaven and why did God take him away from us? So it's just, these are some of the challenges that folks are dealing with when you are hearing these stories about families losing their loved ones to gun violence. Long after the funeral is over, that's when the real work begins. And so I certainly got into this space not out of a desire to, not just because it was a hobby, but it was really because I kind of survived the fire and wanted to find a way to be able to support other families and help communities deal with some of the issues that they are grappling with as well. So with that said, I want to kind of take a step back for a second and see if kind of open it up for some questions. And if there aren't any questions, I can continue on.
Representative, thank you for sharing your story here tonight and for being a part of this important conversation. We can use the chat box function to ask questions, or if you'd like to raise your hand and unmute yourself. We're in a private room here with 60 other friends, so please.
Hey, friends.
Feel free to jump in.
I actually have a question. This is Eileen Dordek, and I'm a social worker, and so I've thought some about the issues you're talking about. I'm wondering what your opinion is about integrating more social workers or social services into policing, as is being discussed these days.
I like the concept and idea. Obviously, some of our we're realizing and seeing in real time, from the COVID pandemic to the crisis around race relations in this country. I think it's become very clear that a lot of the social fabric that we have, that the social contract that we have with one another has been broken. And it's been broken for a long time. And just simply expecting police to be able to manage the wide variety of issues that they face when they go on a call, to be honest with you, it's unfair. And there are instances at times when families may call the police because they don't know what else to do. They may not want this person to be arrested or locked up, but they're unsure what to do other than to call 911 and have a police response. Embedding police officers, I believe it's a beautiful idea, but like most great ideas, the question oftentimes comes back to where the resources going to come from. But I think that, you know, in this moment that we are in right now, we just have to be very honest about how we spend our resources and what are going to be the priorities for us as a state and local communities moving forward as it relates to how we are going to move on from this space that we're in right now in an informed way and try to build a better society. And I think that, you know, having more police officers embedded into, having more social workers embedded into a police force, I think it could be nothing but helpful.
We have a question from Faith Miller. Faith, if you'd like to share your question. Faith, I believe you're on mute.
Yes, here we
There you
go. With respect to overall health and oral health being a part of that, how is that woven into the trauma centers?
So oral health is not a part of any of the trauma centers that have been erected thus far. Each community, so last year during the creation of the Capitol Bill, Illinois Works, we created another investment into the creation of these trauma recovery centers in communities across the state. And so as the years move along, more will be coming online. So this year, you'll likely see this in this next 6 to 9 months, you'll likely see the erection of the Trauma Recovery Center in East St. Louis. You will also see one, yay! You'll also see, Toya, she's clapping. You'll also see one in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood, the Austin neighborhood in Chicago. And so the beauty about trauma recovery centers is, again, you have the ability to tailor the trauma recovery center to the needs that are omnipresent in that community. And oral health is certainly an issue in most communities, but I think that there are just some of the other issues have kind of gotten in front of maybe oral health. But I certainly believe that knowing the issues that oral health have caused in the community over the years, it's certainly a great idea and concept to be thinking about. Dentistry, I think, has taken a hit because of the slow payment of Medicaid.
Yes.
Oftentimes it makes it very difficult for folks to have an overabundance of clients that are on Medicaid. And typically with this population, we're going to be dealing with it would be a high Medicaid population. And that has been one of the challenges with many dentists.
Thank you for that. And we have another question from Samantha. If you would like to unmute yourself and share, please.
Yes, hi. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your story, Representative. I lead the abuse prevention work group for the Illinois Department of Public Health's COVID-19 equity team. And one issue that we regularly talk about is how decentralized and siloed different services are. And so even if there's like abuse happening in a home that's multi-generational, a lot of times like each person is treated individually as opposed to a unit. And I think that this also is an issue with like the resources, like local governments don't even know what resources they have available.
Absolutely.
And so like it's just super disconnected. And I think the trauma recovery center you mentioned, it sounds like one potential solution to that problem, but what do you think that we could be doing to better coordinate that type of care?
So I actually had some of the appropriation staff came down and visited the TRC, we affectionately call it. They came down to visit the TRC here last year, and I don't know what the expectation was, but they were completely wowed at what had been created, because it's exactly what they said, that coordinated. You had resources within communities that had been coordinated in such a way that folks did not have to travel, because transportation is typically an issue when we're talking about these populations that we're talking about serving. We were able to centralize many of the issues and many of the services that those communities have. So the trauma recovery center concept and model certainly is a way to centralize those services. If your community doesn't have a trauma recovery center or isn't slated to get one, there's still a lot of work that can be done with sort of coordinating agencies, but it's a lot of work, right? So someone has to step in and step up to be able to do that work. What I've seen in a couple of other state rep and state senators' offices is oftentimes they become like the centralizing place for many of the community services. It's a lot of work. Typically, you're going to have to hire additional staff beyond, folks have had to hire additional staff beyond what is normally allocated, but it's because it's a passion issue. And so, you know, the aligning of services in the community is really something that should be happening in most communities to be able to, one, be spending our tax dollars most effectively, but two, and more importantly than even one, is to make sure that we're actually getting people the services that they need and that they deserve, and that our tax dollars are already paying for. So we might as well be getting those services to folks.
So I believe we'll have time for one more question, but I want to let Chief Reynolds, I know, will join our program, but I want to let Chief Reynolds has a comment on the previous question. So please, Chief, go ahead.
No, I was just going to provide some information on how we integrate social workers into the police department. There's a significant part of my budget. I contract with Thrive Counseling Services here in Oak Park. We've had a relationship for decades. And rather than have officers make the call on someone in crises, we have the social workers or the counselors come out. They respond with us. In the sense that if there's an emergency or if there's a family dispute, many times, you know, officers make that call whether or not it's a criminal or civil matter. And if it is whether it is a criminal or civil matter, if it's something that can be resolved via, you know, conversation with the counselor, then we have those people come out at all hours of the day. So they're on call 24/7 to respond because they're better suited to make those calls. So that's one way that we've integrated, you know, licensed professionals into our response. And many times when people are in crises or when they're, you know, at their wit's end, like you said, they dial 911. And so in this department, what we tried to be is that that conduit to other resources in the community and third sector services that are available. So that's what we've done here.
Thank you. We have less than a minute, so we can end with this question here from Patty. Did the communities embrace these centers, these trauma centers?
Oh, absolutely. I have not seen a community yet that has not embraced this model. It's really been a way, like we said before, it's been a way to galvanize services within a community and to actually make them more robust. It is the reason why earlier I talked about the ability to be able to get two hospital systems that are oftentimes fighting regularly to be able to get on the same page in order to make this concept work. It is because that folks, particularly practitioners, they know how difficult this work is and how challenging it can be to meet the needs of folks. And if you have the ability to do it under one roof in a place where, you know, people are the most harmed, but oftentimes the least served, it has really been it's really been an amazing thing to see come together. What I also want to offer to the group is if any of you are ever interested and you want to come down and you want to visit the TRC here in Peoria, I would love to host you and your team of folks that you might want to bring with you to see what this looks like and to see what you might be able to bring back to your community. So please just reach out to me. My email is repjgordon, Gordon, @gmail.com. just shoot me an email. I'd love to host you and your team down.
Welcome back, everyone. I certainly hope you learned as much in your breakout session as I learned in mine. And I'm honored now to introduce to you Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx. She has transformed the office of the Cook County State's Attorney. She's made violent crimes, not the low-level ones, the priority for prosecutions. She's making the office transparent and accountable, and she understands the need for reforms that are focused on public safety and equity, and she's making those reforms happen. To lead our discussion with our chiefs of police, please join me in welcoming Kim Foxx. And you can put up your reaction screen. You can hit reactions and it should let you clap. There, I did it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, leader. I appreciate that. And thank you for having this poignant discussion this evening. I'm very honored to have with us on this panel several police chiefs who've been doing innovative work in their communities to talk about where we are in policing in America in the wake of George Floyd. First joining us is Police Chief Lou Jogman, who is 26 years of service in law enforcement. Prior to becoming the police chief of Highland Park in 2018, he served as deputy chief for the city of Park Ridge Police Department, where he lives with his wife and kids. Under his guidance, the Highland Park Police Department became the first in Illinois to embrace a set of 10 shared principles developed by the Illinois Association of Police Chiefs, or Chiefs of Police, and the Illinois NAACP State Conference. And it was designed to build a mutual trust between police and the communities that they serve. He's a graduate of Northwestern's Executive Management and Police Staff and Command program, which is an intensive 10-week program that prepares law enforcement managers for senior positions. And we're so grateful to have him with us this evening. In addition, we have Police Chief LaDon Reynolds. Police Chief Reynolds has been serving as the police chief of Oak Park since 2019 and has over 25 years of law enforcement service under his belt. Climbing through the ranks, Chief Reynolds began as a patrol officer and then went on to serve as a detective, sergeant, and commander before a promotion to deputy chief in 2017. Only 2 years later would he be appointed to run the department, bringing with him new ideas of using social media to connect the department with its residents. And last but certainly not least, we're also honored to have with us tonight Police Chief Kristen Ziman, who's named Police Chief of Aurora in 2016. She has over 25 years of law enforcement experience, first joining the Aurora Police Force in 1994. She too has worked in patrol, field training, community policing, and is a domestic violence detective before her promotion to sergeant, lieutenant, commander, and finally, police chief. She's a graduate of the FBI National Academy, the Kellogg Women's Senior Leadership Program at Northwestern, Harvard's Senior Executive in State and Local Government Program, and a Senior Management Institute for Police. I want to welcome all of our chiefs here with us this afternoon. And you may be like Leader Curry and show your applause digitally. So we'll get started. We all work in the criminal justice space and have seen an incredible amount of changes in our careers. As you've heard from the introduction of all of you, you've had quite extensive careers in law enforcement. So I'll start with what is surprising or the least surprising to you about where we are today in the summer of discontent related to George Floyd. And we'll start with you, Chief Jogman. Are you here?
I'm getting.
There you are.
There we go. It was fighting me. It was not cooperating very well. Well, thank you very, very much for having me, and thank you for the nice comments at the beginning. And I know we've got limited time, so I'm just going to jump in. I will tell you, been doing this 27 years. I thought we were making better progress. I really, really did. I thought we, with community policing and just a lot of the things that I've seen throughout my career from where I started to where we are now, I was hopeful and I was encouraged. The 10 shared principles, which I'm sure we'll talk about shortly, was something that encouraged me, the partnership there. But there is no doubt that there's tremendous amount of work to do, and more than I would have imagined. So while we've gotten here through some very unfortunate instances that you've talked about earlier, and some issues within law enforcement, there's no doubt that we're here now, and I think we do have an opportunity, I'd like to say once and for all, to make appreciative and substantial and significant change in criminal justice, and one that's going to take us to a much better place down the road. So for me, I guess that's the biggest surprise. If you can call it a surprise, I thought we were doing much, much better, and my eyes have been opened, obviously, that we aren't. So.
Thank you. Chief Reynolds.
I wear several hats. So as a police chief and as a citizen, I'm not surprised. I think that it's unfortunate, but it's fortuitous in some regard that we've had the perfect storm with COVID and with the the crises that we are experiencing in this country. It's actually created a space where people can pay attention. If you think about it, people aren't working. A lot of people are frustrated, kind of cooped up in the house. And the things that have happened to bring us to this point this year with George Floyd, these things happen, have continued to happen throughout the years. This hasn't stopped. So this is an opportunity as a nation for us to examine, what policing is in America. And before I say that, this is not an indictment of policing as a whole, because there are almost 18,000 different police departments in this country. And typically, the culture of the organization dictates the performance of the officers in the field. I like to say that, you police through the collective consciousness of the community when you're doing it the right way. But many times there are members of our community that aren't heard and that are silent. So I'm not surprised that we're here. We have, as Chief Jogman has said, we've made a lot of strides through, our relationships with academia, and research has brought us much further than we could have been, but there's still a ways to go. And I'm just excited and encouraged that we're having this national discourse because these are policy issues as well as performance issues. So.
Thank you. Chief Ziman.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I echo some of my counterparts. When I came into this profession, I've been Aurora, Illinois, my entire career, so one department. And when I came in as a 21-year-old rookie, there were no females in rank whatsoever. We're the second largest city in the state of Illinois. And so when I look at policing as it was, and I see an evolution, we came in the 90s and our crime rates were incredibly high. And, we didn't have accountability built into our profession. There were no internal affairs. We recruited from the military. If you were a soldier, then you should become a cop. And that was the natural, progression. And fast forward over the years, I have looked at this as an evolution. And I finally, go places and see female chiefs, people of color that, sit in the major city chiefs. And I've looked at this, and crime has dropped. Community policing has been embraced. So obviously, as we were saying, as we're living in this bubble of what I thought was progress and evolution, and knowing that things were happening, and from the outside looking in, looking at Laquan McDonald and thinking, oh, that would never happen in my police department, and looking across the nation at headlines and thinking, no, our training is really good, and we are a progressive police department, and that would never happen here. And then where we found ourselves, just at that precipice when George Floyd was killed, and how that changed everything. So it's odd, because on one hand, I feel like we've progressed, but on the other hand, I feel like we've been standing still, for the 26 years I've been in law enforcement. So I look at this as, I know there's a lot of people that are leaving the profession, and I look at this as an opportunity to make an even greater evolution in our profession. And I think we're going to start looking into the depths of things that we've never looked at before. We're going to move beyond this buzz of community policing, and I think we're going to start to figure out how to change laws and a plethora of things that are going to allow us to progress.
Yeah, that's a great point that you make, because I think in all of this, there's a real opportunity for a substantive change, like even within the law. And I think one of the things that I think for so many people who have felt hopeful in this particular moment, because it often feels like these are cyclical, that something will happen, there will be a response. In our part of the country, it was Laquan McDonald in 2016, and there was this collective, hey, what are we doing and how do we do this better? And then we find ourselves here. And while George Floyd didn't happen here in Illinois, it resonated so deeply. And so I'll stick with you and we'll go backward in our order. If you say like maybe there's a way that we can change laws, what justice reform initiative would you like to see emerging from this that you think now the time is ripe for?
So we keep hearing the term over policing, and look at George Floyd. It was a counterfeit $20 bill. That's what this stemmed from. Make no mistake, I think violent offenders need to be removed from our community. But I now see, and remember, coming up, in the 90s. And it was the war on drugs. We were just coming off, that era, and that's been instilled in us. And so, as we've taken a look back and we look at the laws that are on the books, but our job is to enforce the laws. That's what we are, law enforcement. There's nothing sexy about that in the title. And so we have this, this is what we're charged with. Now, can we do it by treating people with human dignity and respect? Absolutely. But what we're starting to see is that, we're employing, use of force situations and things that, why did we, even have to apply force in that situation? Why couldn't we just let them run away, right? I mean, that's the question people ask. Why couldn't you just let Laquan McDonald walk away from you with that knife in his hand? So when I say that, what reform needs to be made, first of all, I'm only of average intelligence. If I knew the right answer, I would give it to you, but I think it's so many things. And one of them, we have to start looking at the criminal justice system as a whole, because we as law enforcement say, whoa, we were just enforcing that law, shoplifting, what we called, low level crimes, right? We were just enforcing the law. Marijuana is illegal, and then marijuana, then was not illegal, suddenly. So I think that we need to look at this as a collective whole, and truly, when we want to reform, then we have to look at legislation involved in that as well, to say, okay, well, maybe some other entities can deal with this particular situation, and maybe the police don't have to come in right away. So that's just off the top of my head.
Yeah. Chief Reynolds.
So, I think I have a little bit different perspective. I agree with Chief Ziman and a lot of what she said, but, when I look at local law enforcement, local police departments, municipalities, law enforcement is just a small percentage of what we do. We are the police. And when you talk about police, you're talking about the police mandate, which is to care for the health, welfare, and safety of the community, right? 200 years ago, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, the 9 principles of policing from Sir Robert Peel were written. And one of the things he said is that the police are the public and the public are the police being only those members of the public who are paid to give full-time attention to duties that are incumbent upon all citizens. Now, when I say the role of police in society, it's really about, ensuring the blessings of liberty, right? Police through the Constitution. And part of that is creating public value. So locking up somebody for a low-level crime, or putting someone who's in a mental health crisis into the county jail because we actually created a situation that facilitated their arrest. What I mean by that is escalating a situation such as the Laquan McDonald murder. That young man was, all the officers were in cars, and there was no threat to them until they got out of the car and escalated it. So I think part of it is accountability. We talk about George Floyd. There was a history for that police officer. That wasn't the first time he had an infraction. So for me, it's police reform has to include accountability, right? Police departments are staffed by human beings, and human beings are fallible. However, when they step outside of policy, when they act outside of the law, then they need to be held accountable. And there also needs to be some sort of mechanism in place so that they can't move to another police department, either in this state or another state, to become police and create the same type of environment or violate the same policies and rules. So I think accountability is key. I think, understanding, I think officers coming into the profession need to understand what their true duties and responsibilities are. It's not to write tickets and arrest bad guys. It's really to create public value. The largest investment that any of us make as adults is where we choose to buy a home. And when you're purchasing a home, you're buying a zip code, right? So you're buying the services that that zip code provides, whether it's police services, public works, the fire department when they're not asleep. Did I say that out loud? I'm sorry. My point is that you're buying those services, you're buying the school district. And so all public servants need to be a return on that investment. And police are, the duties and responsibilities of police officers are no different. So accountability is key, and also recruitment is key. Making sure that the individuals that we're bringing into policing, because this is a very, very complex job. It's developed into a very complex job. And making sure that the individuals have the right temperament, have the right mindset, and the right perspective on what it is that they can do to create public value in that community. I could talk for hours, but I'll turn it over to somebody else.
I'm gonna come back to you. I'm gonna let you talk some more.
All right.
Chief Jongman.
Yeah, so reform, I think it's happening now. I think the big issue is we as a society have to decide what we want our police to do. And it depends on who you ask, and you get different answers. We've taught our public to call 911 because you get that quick response, that immediate response. Calling a city council or elected officials, you certainly don't get that quick response. So folks call us and they want an immediate answer to a problem. So we've kind of been thrown into that position with mental health issues and homelessness and all of the things that we're dealing with right now. I can tell you, my officers and officers in general that I speak to, they would prefer to have the people who are adequately trained to deal with those things. But our public has come to use the police, for an immediacy to deal with these issues, and they want, quick results. So I think with respect to reform, the biggest thing that we have to do collectively is decide, what do we want our police to do, and what is the role? And we're having that conversation now. Truly, we are. And again, you'll hear from folks who talk about defunding. I also had to get my head around that, when you hear it, at first I was a little taken aback, but I understand the concept, and I understand that it could work if we had a transition, for instance, to get to that place where we've got the right people in place to address those things. But unfortunately, those people right now are us. And so if we never have those people in place, making that transition is going to be impossible to get folks there to help those, because those calls are still coming in. So with respect to reform, I just, like I said, I don't know that we'll come to a great consensus, because the one thing I've learned in law enforcement is I'm going to make one group happy by the same action, I make another group completely unhappy. And I know as a state's attorney, you know that as well. So
that's my life.
That's right. And we try to make everybody happy, and we just make not everybody happy. So as an example, we get called for speeding vehicles on a street. Okay, they want us to go write tickets because they're unhappy. We're not doing enough. The police, what are you doing? We go, we write speeding tickets. We slow traffic down. Those folks that we pull over, what are you doing? Don't you have anything better to do with your time? I mean, come on, really, a speeding ticket? Why don't you go fight crime? We are constantly in that position as law enforcement officers. And we, I guess, just want to kind of we want to know what our communities want. And we're happy to accommodate that. But I think we're going to need that clear direction. And that's why I'm encouraged about the fact that we are talking as a nation. What I'm concerned about is we can't often agree on the weather. So we'll see how we get there. But at least the conversations we're having them, and people are open to talking about this. So it is a good thing. And I'll end with, just to leave it as an encouraging moment, in my 27 years, I've never seen law enforcement as responsive to being open to this discussion. We usually circle the wagons. We get, we have gotten defensive, and I can tell you, so I'm encouraged by that. My colleagues and law enforcement in general, from a patrol officer level to a chief level, I've seen a huge shift in openness. So that's encouraging and good.
Thank you. So you bring up the piece around the narrative or the question about what do people want, and the phrase "defund the police" has become a phrase that we've heard a lot in the last several weeks. But I think it's to your point where I think people are trying to define what is the role of policing. And for many communities, particularly Black and Brown communities, who feel like the role of policing is just what you said, has been everything. It is, for some, it feels like an occupying force. It feels as though everything is being monitored, everything is being suppressed, whether it's with parking tickets or fees or riding a bicycle on the sidewalk. We see, young people get pulled or, come and get patted down because it's an infraction to ride your bike on the sidewalk. In certain communities, you see it all the time, and it's not where people would use their police powers to enforce. But I guess where we are now, and I think there's far more agreement, to your point, even among law enforcement, that we have asked for law enforcement to do far more than what they should be responsible for. And that in fact, we are responders, right? People talk a lot about first responders. We respond after an act has occurred. And I think when we have this conversation around the funding, we're talking about prevention. How do we stop the act from actually happening in the first place? How do we make sure that we are not arriving once a chalk outline has been drawn? We're not arriving after the harm has been caused. And to the point that was made in our little breakout group is that we spend a lot of money responding to crime, and it doesn't seem proportionate to the amount of money that we invest in preventing crime. And whether that's in healthcare, education, economic opportunity, all of these things that feel really big. And my question is, I think we all agree that that is out of balance. If you could design the world of what police should be engaged in, I'll let you think about it, Chief Jogman, because I saw your eyes blink. If you could design what police would be doing in your community, we'll start with you, Chief Reynolds, and not doing. If they could stop doing X and focus on Y, what would that be?
So, I tell you, that it's tough for me because I'm very comfortable with the role that we play in, the community here in Oak Park. I am a true believer that the police are the public and the public are the police. When I teach classes, and one of the things I talk about is, if you look at the number of police officers versus the population. So you take a city like New York and you've got 9 million people and you've got about 50,000 police officers, right? It takes voluntary compliance to have law and order, right? It's not the police controlling anything. There are 9 million people out there, and with the police, they're not controlling anything. This is really about the community working together for safety. That being said, I think it gets to be a little, I don't want to say dangerous, but it can be a slippery slope when we try to have a national consciousness on what all community police, all municipalities should have their police doing. I firmly believe that police in the United States are at the local level. We don't have a national police force. I think we should have national standards, but I think that conversation about what the police should be doing should be with the individual municipalities and the local governments talking to their citizens. That being said, for Oak Park, we have our foundation is community policing. I know that's a catchphrase, but for us, what we've done is there are chronic issues that give rise to crime and quality of life. And what we have a unit called the Resident Beat Officer Unit, where officers live in the community or are dedicated to various different zones, and they're your 24/7 police officer. Now, they work with the patrol division to solve problems within the community through the collective collaboration with the citizens, the businesses, the third sector organizations. So I'm very comfortable with us being that resource. but also knowing what our role is and knowing what our expertise is. So if we have a person in mental health crisis, then we're going to call somebody who knows how to deal with that. If we have a citizen that's a victim of domestic violence, then we're going to get them the resources in the community that they need. So not only are we a conduit for the criminal justice system, I think that's a lesser part of our job. I think we're a conduit to government and local services. And, you know, by us being on the street all the time, we're able to, again, create public value. For example, you know, officers carry Narcan now. How many lives have been saved because officers have administered Narcan? Yes, the fire department is there. The ambulance will come in about 5 minutes, but the officer is right there with that tool. So I think there's public value in that. I think these conversations need to take place at a local level. When there are people who are operating outside of policy, you have to hold those individuals accountable. We don't want to throw out, this is a terrible phrase, but we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. What we want to do is examine what's working, look at what the real problems are, and to me, it's accountability. If somebody is not suited to do this job, they need to be removed. It's very difficult to fire a police officer in the state of Illinois and in this country. And so those are the things we need to look at. So if I was imagining a perfect police department, it's a police department that creates public value and works collaboratively with the citizens and provides the services that that department needs. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Great. Unless my other two chiefs want to jump in, I know we are running short on time for audience questions, and I'll turn it over to our team at IWIL.
Great, thank you so much. And there was an illuminating discussion. We appreciate all your time. I'm going to pass it over to Mayor Nancy Rotering.
Great, and thank you so much, State's Attorney Foxx, and to our chiefs. Really appreciate all of the important discussion we've been having tonight. I know many of us would like to stay for another 3 hours. Unfortunately, we need to let people go to continue on with their lives. But to that event, I will quickly jump to the important questions that have been posed. Thank you to so many people for posing questions. Hopefully we can get to a number of them. From Nikita Richards, thank you, chiefs, for being here tonight. Can any of you share your thoughts on implementing duty to intervene initiatives and providing greater protections for those officers who engage?
Yeah, I can start with that. The duty to intercede should be something that is in every police policy. But as we know, policies are just that, a bunch of words, you know, on a piece of paper. And so if the culture is not set to have the duty to intervene, you know, you can have a policy that says do not, you know, commit an excessive use of force. But then, you know, depending upon what the culture is in that organization and what they overlook, or how they are complicit in that. So the duty to intercede needs to be something that is set forth in the culture. And by that, I mean, it is trained upon. And so in our department, not only do we have de-escalation built into our training, and we have 6 mandatory trainings per year, which is, I believe, part of the reason why you don't see Aurora negatively on the headlines. And then built into that training is also, we have a training scenario where our young officers come in and they actually see an officer, you know, wearing a uniform that's using excessive force on someone, and they are watched in that scenario and determine what they are doing in that scenario. And then they're, you know, we've even had officers that go and physically remove them from that. So building that into the consciousness, because I truly believe that you play like you practice. And the top 3 things that a police department has to have is training, training, and training. And so that duty to intercede needs to not only be in policy, but also in practice.
Great, thank you. From Sandy Hart, IWIL alum. One justice reform initiative that I'd like to see is to have our public defenders appointed by an independent commission or a county board rather than the judiciary. Illinois is one of only 5 or 6 states in the country in which the county public defender is appointed by the courts. The PDs see what's happening in the courtroom and can more freely advocate for their clients when they're independent from the judiciary. This is also a key tenet of the National Association of Public Defenders. Do you see any momentum to change this?
Just very quickly, for clarification, the public defender is appointed by the Cook County Board President and approved by the County Board of Commissioners. So they are not appointed by the judiciary here in Cook County. And I'm not sure how it works in other counties, but in Cook, they are appointed by the County Board President with the consent of the board.
And thank you so much for saying that. But all the other counties are by the county board. Thank you.
Thank you. From Ty Sherrod, as someone who has personally responded unarmed to emergency situations such as suicidal ideation, sexual violence, and armed robbery, I'm wondering if anyone has looked at the public safety model already in place within higher education as a roadmap to rethink public safety more broadly.
I'm not familiar with the roadmap that they provided. Could they expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah, not either. If somebody could.
Ty?
I asked that question. I'm Ty. Thank you all for being here. As I mentioned, I have been in on-call capacities working with my students in higher education where I have responded to multiple situations, as I've mentioned, including, unfortunately, armed robbery. And we're managed to make sure that my campus was safe and did so as being unarmed. And so I'm wondering, has anyone looked at the model that has been used in higher education for quite some time to ensure accountability, because we want to make sure that our students are accountable in our areas where they reside, but also do so through trauma-informed care and with student well-being being at the forefront and the priority. So has anyone spoken to folks in higher ed who routinely has used this model for a long time to be able to deal with these very difficult situations and have positive outcomes?
Okay, so I can speak to that. I've actually been a member of the law enforcement. There's a cadre of individuals that go out and teach the campus safety and security program. We teach K through 12 in higher ed on emergency preparedness and response to incidents. And so, yes, I'm very familiar with that. I think there are a lot of police departments that use similar models. You know, getting those professionals that have the expertise to address those situations in the room. I think Chief Jogman mentioned, or I heard that they also contract with social service agencies to respond to individuals in crises. As it relates to being unarmed, I know that there are, you know, portions of the police force in England and some places in Europe that are unarmed. That's not really something that we've brought into play here in the United States, but we do have in my department community service officers that do a lot of the same work that officers do, but they don't have arrest powers. So in that regard, we have, you know, civilian and sworn individuals available to respond to citizens' needs. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you, Chief. From Julie Hamas, how important is the police chief in creating the norms, values, and culture of her own police department?
Go ahead, Chief.
I'll defer to you, Chief Ziman, but absolutely imperative. Go ahead, Chief Ziman.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, it's almost what I said about policies, you know, and it's especially in coming into my police department, I can give you a specific example, and it really lends into this discussion, is that prior to this, we had an agency that liked to count things, count arrests, you know, how many misdemeanors, and this was then a part of a matrix where, you know, an officer's performance was judged by all of these numbers. And so when I came in, I got rid of all of that and said, start now taking time on calls. It's not about quantity. It is actually about prevention. It's about going to this call. And because we've got 307 sworn officers and every single one of them has had crisis intervention training. So they can go there and they can hopefully determine what the root of the problem is. We have 5 social workers on site. So once then they determine what the problem is, we can work with a social worker and hopefully we will not have to respond. But the culture that a chief sets is basically, you know, asking officers or giving officers permission to spend more time in community engagement situations, in problem solving situations, and not necessarily, of course, we have to respond to the priority one where life is in danger, but it's about, throwing all of that, get to the next call and hurry up, solve the problem when you're on the call. And when we talk about community policing as having COP officers, I have 18 of those, but I have 307 that have that philosophy instilled in them. So I think that's what it's about, is that chief sets the culture of an organization and what principles are important to them.
And I'll just add to that. We really are having a greater conversation about the guardian versus warrior mentality in law enforcement. It's been mentioned a couple of times here, when we've gotten our military folks back, in the day, they'd come out. There are times you have to be a warrior in law enforcement, and it's unfortunate, but you've seen them, across the country. Sometimes we've got to respond to save lives and to make sure people are safe. But the vast majority of the time, you should be working in the guardian mindset, that you're taking care of your community, working with your community, partnering with your community, and looking out for them to help people. So that includes people who've committed crimes, people that are homeless, people that have mental illness. So I think the chief plays a huge role in where that percentage is. Are you focusing on community engagement, or are you focusing on enforcement? And so I really do believe, as Chief Ziman said, the chief's background when they're leading that organization is going to, have a profound impact on what those officers are doing. And I think it just depends on, when your chiefs change from time to time, so does your culture and your organization. And so we all bring with us history and background and experience. And so, of course, when you look at different departments throughout the state, throughout the country, you're going to have all, just like a different community, each community is different. Same holds true for a law enforcement agency. And it really is, dependent on that chief executive officer, what those officers are going to focus on.
Thank you. This is our last question. I'm sorry, everybody. Research, this is from Denise Stonebeck. Thank you, Denise. Research shows more restrictive use of force policies can reduce killings by police. There are 8 that can't wait that were discussed at President Obama's virtual town hall in the wake of George Floyd's killing. These policies include banning chokeholds, requiring de-escalation, requiring warning before shooting, duty to intervene, banning of shooting at moving vehicles, and more. Have your cities adopted these policies to reduce the use of force by police? And what are your thoughts?
Most of those policies are kind of founded in Illinois law, and most police departments have had those policies. I can't speak for everybody, but I would imagine that most Illinois police departments have had those policies on the books for years, maybe even decades. It's been against our policy to shoot at moving vehicles and things of that nature for a long time. So.
Yep, same with us. We've banned chokeholds, can't shoot at moving vehicles, all of those things that you just mentioned. Yes, we have all of those.
Yeah, as do we, and state statute precludes most of those as well. And I think it goes to the conversation we had earlier. Policies are important because you have to have them and set the standards for your officers, but it really then is incumbent upon the culture to make sure they're following those policies. Because I would venture a guess that all these departments that have had issues, throughout the country have policies, and those officers just elected not to follow those policies. And so while the policies are important, there's no doubt about it, you have to have that framework, no question. More importantly, you need the culture to hold people accountable, to make sure your officers understand that they need to hold each other accountable and that they can have those uncomfortable conversations with each other and with their supervisors because they've seen what happens when you don't. And I think that that's the important conversations that are happening in law enforcement today that weren't happening in law enforcement a year ago. So that is one piece of encouragement that I take away, where we're at today.
I just want to quickly say, Nancy, before you go on, to the point that they all just made, that a lot of this had been codified in Illinois state law, to talk about the fact that we have this panel with police chiefs, but this is also a legislative issue. And so where IWIL and the work that you all do in making sure that, one, we have effective legislative leaders and the advocacy on these issues even before this. So we were ahead of the curve on a lot of these things that are being introduced in the wake of George Floyd because of the strong leadership by many of the women that we have on this call tonight, in Lieutenant Governor Stratton, former Senator Hutchinson, Leader Jehan Gordon-Booth, Leader Curry, these are things that they had been marinating and working on for years that have well positioned Illinois. We have a lot of work to do, but the fact that these mandates that were just described have been codified before this time talks about the tremendous value and resource of having strong legislative leadership lead on these issues, not simply in times of crisis, but because it is the right thing to do at all times.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thanks everybody for your questions. To those who weren't able to be heard, whose questions weren't responded to, we will pass them on to our panel with the hopes that we can hopefully return those answers to you despite the time constraints. Thank you. I now hand this back to Barbara Flynn Curry.
Thank you very much, Nancy, and thank you all for a meaty, interesting, provocative evening. I'm grateful again to the panelists for sharing your time and for your expertise. Thank you to each and every one of us for listening and learning. Again, a special recognition of our class of 2020, our board and alumni, and a huge thank you to Mayor Roderine and Toy Hutchinson and the rest of the programming committee because they put this forum together. We want you to know, finally, that we at the IWIL Training Academy continue our programs during COVID-19, albeit our sessions are now virtual. But remember that we offer our programs at no cost to our participants, to our class members, and that can only happen because of your very generous support. We are a small organization, but our reach is large. Please consider contributing. We've made it easy. We put links in both the chat box and in your program. And your help is what will help us continue to training Democratic women across the state of Illinois to run for public office and to win. Thank you all very much. And if you want to respond to how pleased you were with the program, remember that reactions bottom at the bottom of your screen. Just open it up and clap a hand. So thank you, everybody.